Hello, good afternoon. It's Thursday at 4 o'clock. It must be time for another teissTalk with me, your host, author and investigative journalist, Jeff White. Hello to all of you joining us. If you're coming back and a repeat viewer, we love our repeat viewers here on teissTalk. Welcome to all of you. If you're a first timer here, hello, a big hello to you. Do get involved. We've got the chat window there and you can put your comments and your snipes in there. We also have the Q&A box if you want to ask us any questions along the way. We are live every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. discussing all of the key technology security issues with our fantastic panels. You can, of course, catch up on the teissTalks online. If you've missed any of them, all of the teissTalks are archived on the Teiss website. But what will be the point? You're here live because you want to see it as it happens, and I don't blame you. I've got some chat already saying hello to all of you. Hello, hello, hello to all of our attorneys. As I say, the chat window is yours to play with as you wish. We love hearing from our teissTalk attendees on the programme. We also have, as a tradition, to give away a teissTalk mug, the coveted teissTalk mug. Today, normally the teissTalk mug is full of decaffeinated tea, because as you long-time teissTalk viewers will know, I gave up caffeine accidentally during lockdown with disastrous consequences. Today, the teissTalk mug is full of something else in the teissTalk mug. So I will give away a free teissTalk mug to whoever can either accurately guess what's in my teissTalk mug or B, comes up with the most amusing suggestion. So please, in the chat, put your guesses. What's in Jeff's teissTalk mug today? And you can win one of these beauties for your ever-growing collection. I believe some people have quite a few of those. So whatever's in the mug, have a guess. No, Simon, it's not Vimto. So there we go. That's your task as we go along here. Look, folks, fantastic to have you with us today. Really appreciate your attendance, particularly since things are slightly kicking off in the cyber world at the moment. Plenty going on. We have also got plenty going on the show today because we're going to be talking about the topic of resilience, defining and assessing your cyber resilience. Topic we've touched on a bit before. We're going to drill down into that, particularly because the government's got a consultation out about it at the moment. We're going to be taking a good look through that. We've got a fantastic panel joining us for a conversation on resilience. Later on, we're going to be hearing from Steve Brown, who's Cybersecurity Director at MasterCard, and Kevin Duffy, who's Managing Director at the Cyber Rescue Alliance. But joining us first guest on this, we've got Ben Lindgreen, who's Head of Cyber Resilience at Pay.uk, who's joining us now. Ben, how are you? Oh, Ben is on mute. There you go.
There we go. Sorry about that. I thought the button opened both the video and the mic. That shows me what I know. Very well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you for the invite to this. Hopefully, I'll be able to remain off mute and actually add some content.
Fair enough. I will remind you, obviously, if I ask you a question and I can't hear you, I will remind you if you're on mute. That's fine. Couple of guesses for the mug. What's in the mug? We've got vodka martini. Stirred, not shaken. That's a good guess. Not right, unfortunately. At least a percentage of nitrogen and oxygen from Lee Morton is accurate. And probably a contender so far. Warm Lucozade, says Benjamin. No, it's not that. Danny says it just looks like warm Lucozade. No, I'm not drinking my own urine. Mark Morris says sex on the beach, which I take it is the cocktail and not a suggestion for that. So some good suggestions so far for our teissTalk mug. Sorry to interrupt you there, Ben, with those. But so Pay UK, I mean, talk just for folks who don't know what Pay.uk is and does, give us the top line.
Yeah, so we've had numerous names over the last few years, but basically we run the UK's retail payment systems. So BACS, faster payments, and check and credit clearing services. So if you do direct debits or direct credits, or you ever do online banking, we're the rails that facilitate the connections between your banks. So overall, I think it was last year we had, let me try and remember the numbers because I don't want my comms people to get upset with me, 9.5 billion transactions during the year with a total of over £7 trillion went across our systems.
Astonishing. And I tell you that probably went up during lockdown period,
yes.
Did it at all?
So unsurprisingly, our check volumes went down, but faster payments went up.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. And the direct debit stuff, that's interesting because I always thought that the bank sort of sorted that out. But so when I fill in my little direct debit slip and send it off to the gym or whatever that I'm part of, does that slip then sort of go through you guys and then onto the bank? Is that how that works?
You're asking me, the things that I should know the answers to. Yes, I think it is. We're involved in that process, and we set the rules and how that works, and then the banks facilitate those connections between themselves. So in fact, we set the standards and the requirements for those things to happen.
I see. I see. Okay. Okay. And it's interesting because on your CV, you've sort of been attached to the various bits of the various things that now make up Pay.uk. You've kind of done a bit of Backs, a bit of faster payment and PM, and now
Absolutely.
Pay.uk combines them all together.
So I've been with the firm 11 years in total. During that time, we've been one separate company, and then the individual scheme companies were mandated to be separate companies. But we in the security team still supported them. So for a period, I think it was 5 email addresses, 5 business cards, and depending on what piece of work I was working on, I could be working directly for Backs or for faster payments or working for them all together. And I think it was probably 2.5 years ago, we now brought the individual scheme companies back into the single organisation, now Pay.uk. So now we refer to them as service lines rather than payment schemes, but they're just different ways that payments can be made.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Did you really have 5 different business cards and email addresses?
Absolutely. So we provided a federated service because, as well as the individual scheme companies, we also had, in effect, a back office organisation as well that looks after the IT, looks after HR, all of those things. So I was technically employed by them, but worked directly for each of the individual scheme companies.
Interesting. It's a bit like having an undercover identity with all sorts of different passports. Did you have to sort of remember what you told to different people in different? I spoke to you my Backs capability, and that
yes.
was.
And more confusingly, I had to make sure that I actually emailed from the right email address because I had the individual email addresses all in my single Outlook instance. So I had to make sure that it came from an FPS address or a back address. Yeah, it's much easier in the new world where we're just all Pay.uk.
Yeah, I can imagine. That reminds me of working for an internet company where a colleague of mine had sat at the same desk for 3 years and had 3 different employers because the company had been bought out and taken over by different people. So yeah. I mean, in terms of the cyber resilience stuff, so you're doing the resilience of things like Backs and direct debits and so on, as opposed to the partners that you work with, or a bit of both? How does it work?
So really, we tend to look at more from the realms of operational resilience, so of which cyber obviously is a big part of that. And what we do as a scheme company, we manage the relationship with Vocalink, who are our infrastructure providers, who are now owned by MasterCard, and Steve, who's going to be joining us later. And we set the rules and the requirements for our individual participants for them to be able to be members of these individual schemes. So we set certain security requirements, and then there are certain technological controls and requirements that we build in partnership with Vocalink.
So who would be a participant? Give us an example of what a participant would be.
Barclays, HSBC, any of the banks, building societies, but also increasingly now, as we look to work broader than just the retail payments systems, there are some of the new fintechs, Monzos and the like. They will be members of they will use some of our services. So a large traditional bank like Barclays may be a customer of Backs, faster payments and checking credit, whereas some of the newer fintechs who have a different focus for their banking, they may decide that they just wish to be members of faster payments, as an example.
Right, interesting. So if I want to pay into one of the sort of newer fintech kind of things, I might use faster payments, whereas if I wanted to pay into my Barclays account, I might use a check, and that would go through sort of different channels, it were.
Yeah, that will go through different channels. Part of it will depend on whether your bank actually offers checks as to that. But the other thing is that if your banking institution isn't a direct participant, it may still have a customer arrangement with a sponsoring bank who will provide those services for you. So the bank will still enable faster payments, but it may go through an intermediary who will do the settlement for that banking institution.
Right. Okay. And so when you say Vocalink are the sort of the technical channel, the infrastructure channel that sort of goes through.
Yeah.
I'm still sort of a bit confused with Pay UK's role. Then obviously you're overseeing the sort of standards and that kind of thing. Is it more of a sort of standard setting, compliancy type?
Yes, in a nutshell. So we are the retail payment system operators. So the Bank of England, we're recognised payment systems, Backs and faster payments. And we manage that relationship with Vocalink, and Vocalink provide the actual technical infrastructure that facilitates those payments. So we're the company that manages. If you were a banking institution and you wanted to join us, you would discuss the actual joining with Pay.uk, and then there would be technical discussions with Vocalink about how to achieve that technical connection.
Right, interesting. Yeah, because I'm just looking at this through the sort of cyber resilience prism. On a sort of technical level, I can kind of understand for Vocalink type people what that looks like, keeping the channels up and running, have backups and redundancies and all that kind of thing. From a sort of compliancy type point of view, what does resilience look like for you? How are you implementing that and overseeing that?
So for resilience, obviously, that we, within the concepts of operational resilience, you have the concepts of important business services and then impact tolerances. So the length of time that a business service could be unavailable before it caused intolerable harm to our customers. And obviously, our customers are both the individual banks, but also you yourself, Jeff, if you wish to make a payment through faster payments. So when we're looking in resilience terms, there's looking at the obvious uptime. Faster payments is a 24/7 system that's always up and running, with near real-time confirmation that payment has gone through. So the actual uptime is a key element, but for payment systems, the integrity of the payments are just as important. So from a resilience perspective, it's not just the concepts of always being available, but it's being available in a secure way, and that you can have confidence that if you say that that you want to make £100 payment, that it does end up as being £100 payment.
Interesting. And how much of that? It's an odd question to ask this, actually. I realise as I'm asking it, but how much of that resilience work is around malicious actors, and how much is it around just cock-ups in the system, or things falling over and that kind of thing? How much of your work's divided between protecting against malicious stuff and protecting against, if you like, accidents?
I think historically we've perhaps had a little bit more of a focus on the more of the malicious aspects, but also a big thing that we've been doing recently is looking at improved mechanisms that we can help end customers make payments. So you may have heard of a service called confirmation of payee, which is now that when you type in the sort code and account number and then you put in the name, it confirms that the address is correct. And this is key, not just from preventing fraud, but which is a really important thing but also just those accidental mistakes. Previously, when it was just sort code and account number, obviously you could make a small mistake with an account number and there was no check to make sure the name's there. So it's really important that we provide a service to our end customers that makes it easier for them to make payments, as well as making sure that it doesn't introduce new mechanisms for fraud.
Right, interesting. Yeah, my bank, when they introduced that, clearly whoever did the sort of development and implementation had a bit of a sense of humour, because you type in the name of the payee and it would obviously check, as you've said, whether the payee name, the account name on the recipient account matches the payee name you've just typed in. And if it did, it would come up with "it's a match," which is obviously, I think, what you see on Tinder when you match on. And clearly, somebody at the top must have said to them, "No, that's a bit too informal." Because I noticed now they've changed it. I won't say which bank it is, but I did think that was quite charming, and I was quite sorry to see it disappear.
I think that is one of our key strengths. That we will set rules and standards, but then we will allow organisations to implement it in a way that fits their processes and their culture. So it's not a mandated, centrally provided service. Individual institutions will do their own confirmation of payee based on the rule sets that we provide.
Yeah, interesting. Well, let's come. We're going to have a chat about something that's been in the news recently, which is obviously dead relevant for what we're talking about, which is the government consultation on cyber resilience, which, as you can see there, is on the gov.uk website. I think our teissElf, who beavers away tirelessly in the background, thanks so much. Our teissElf is going to put up the link there. That's on the gov.uk site, so you can go take a look at it. Obviously, this has come off the back of some quite heavy critical national infrastructure cyber attacks, SolarWinds being the one that I think is mentioned in that particular article there. Sort of supply chain attacks that have really, really cost the US government certainly dear in terms of cybersecurity. And it's a proposal for legislation to improve cyber resilience. And Ben, I just wondered what you make of that. The traditional approach from government, I think, has been, well, if you can't sort it out yourself, we'll legislate for it. Is this a sort of desperation thing? The government saying, well, you can't sort it out, we're going to have to legislate?
I think even though that they're looking to legislate and they're looking at, I think this is extending it to digital service providers. But I think one of the things within the consultation, it talks about that, for a lot of firms, they may not have dedicated security resource. They may not have a massive budget to enable them to work on security. And obviously, with the rise in cloud and all those elements, a lot more firms are looking to cloud to try and ease some of their IT costs. But I think for me, the element that's missing from the focus on cyber resilience is, as a business, you really need to understand what your processes are, what your critical processes are, so that when you go to a provider, you make sure that you're getting what's fit for you and has the appropriate controls. I think sometimes there can be a little bit too much focus on thinking that technology will solve all of your problems, and you need to make sure that you actually look at your people, your process, so that if you're using a service provider, that you understand what your requirements are. Because, you know, I've looked at cloud offerings. There are hundreds of configuration options. There are lots of different ways that you can do it. Infrastructure as a service, software as a service. I think it would be good if smaller organizations had a little bit more help in trying to enable them to determine what type of services they should actually get. That in itself would provide resilience, not necessarily just putting a large onus on security controls. Security controls are good, but you need the whole gamut of elements, say the people and the process as well.
Is that where you think this legislation will end up then, in terms of you know, sort of security controls checklist kind of thing? Is that what you fear?
I think benchmarks are good. I think standards like ISO 27001 can be good, but a big chunk of the ISO standard, as opposed to Cyber Essentials and that, is more about the culture and having the risk management framework and having that overall framework in an organization. If you're a small firm, you might be able to implement some of the Cyber Essentials elements, but it doesn't really look at things in the risk management aspects and all of those elements as much. And as an organization, you know, certainly for us, obviously being a large organization, it's that risk management that's a key element, and understanding what our business services are to make sure that we put appropriate controls in. And I know I think it's IASME that looks at small and medium. I don't tend to work in the small and medium bit, so that's a little less my area of knowledge. But I think it's organizations like that that will really help to build the actual security maturity of smaller organizations, rather than necessarily government legislation like this.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. It reminds me of the conversation around the online harms bill at the moment, and in terms of who the online harms bill will impact, and the risk that the online harms bill is meant to be targeting the Facebooks of this world and the Metas of this world, and might actually end up targeting smaller companies or end up impacting smaller companies as well.
I noticed in the chat that Danny says that Cyber Essentials is risk agnostic, and it absolutely is. But that in itself is one of the challenges that some of our larger participants can sometimes have a challenge in actually meeting the Cyber Essentials requirements, because, you know, that the patching standards is it's blunt. It's you must patch in X days. Well, I know that there are certain, you know, of our customers and larger organizations, they may have systems that they're not able to patch in a timely manner because of the criticality of them, but they're taking a risk-based approach to that, and they may have other compensating controls. And Cyber Essentials, quite rightly, doesn't really allow for that, because it's for those smaller organizations where it would be best just to make sure you've got auto update put in, and that they're done in a timely manner. And I think that's a challenge for organizations as they get bigger. It's how you bridge that divide between the straight Cyber Essentials, you must do it now, and when that can cause likely only a small increase in risk, but a perceptible increase in risk by patching so quickly.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It reminds me of the WannaCry NHS thing, where it's like, well, we should have patched, but, you know, do you really want them to turn your life support machine off while they patch the software for it? To take a deep breath, and we're just going to run the update.
Exactly.
As Danny Dresner's in the chat has said, IASME version 6 is on the way. I hope Hermione Granger makes a comeback. That's all I can say in that. Look, let's welcome our other panelists. So we've been chuntering on. Our other panelists have been waiting in the wings to join us. We've got Steve Brown, who's Cybersecurity Director at MasterCard, and Kevin Duffy, Managing Director at the Cyber Rescue Alliance, both joining us now. Welcome to both of you. Steve, can I come to you first of all?
Of course.
Because as Ben said, sort of VocalLink, part of MasterCard, sort of runs the underlying sort of rails of this. But before we get talking about that, there was something I wanted to pick up, which maybe outside your remit, I'm not sure, but there's big change, isn't there, in the sort of card for the customers, the owners of the cards. There's this change coming down the line of secure customer authentication, this SCA thing that's coming through. What am I going to see that's different as a card holder, as a MasterCard holder, when that stuff all comes through, and when do we think it's going to come through?
Well, hopefully you're going to see a more secure journey, but the beauty of it and the balance, for the importance for us is to retain a balance between a smooth consumer experience, but also to ensure there's security wrapped around that. You know, we all want to be able to buy goods and services whenever we want, but I think we appreciate there has to be some level of friction involved if we are to have the sort of retention and confidentiality and availability and integrity of our data to be withheld. To withstand any sorts of impact at any different point throughout that journey. So it's important for us at MasterCard to be able to implement SCA, but to also ensure that it doesn't detract from the customer journey or the transition of being able to secure a smooth transaction.
Right. So are we talking, will the checks go on in the background, or will I, as the card holder and the customer?
You as a card holder, the customer wouldn't see it. Well, hopefully won't see it. If you have, then something would have gone wrong. But it's all going on in the background. It's all going on in the sort of mechanism of the payment processing platform.
Right.
But we're always looking to improve whatever service it is. We're always looking to build upon if there's regulations, if there's legislation. Now, often what we want to be able to do is improve the customer journey. But again, it's to ensure that as the ecosystem develops, and we are one of the reasons for the ecosystem developing, we are morally obliged, but we want to be able to ensure that the security develops alongside it and ensure that also regulation and legislation keeps pace with the threat and the risk that we all face, both professionally and personally.
Yeah, interesting. I know it's one for the reason I was one for the merchants and retailers. I know that they're very interested in this, so it'd be remiss of me not to ask about that.
Of course.
Kevin, can I come to you? The Cyber Rescue Alliance. Just give us the once over for those who aren't familiar with it. What does the alliance do?
We help the boardroom at a few hundred companies to lead business recovery after a breach that they often think happened in the basement, but more likely happened at a third-party supplier in the cloud, at one of those digital service providers that they suddenly discover that Pay.UK is dependent on Vocalink, that most of the people who are listening, they're dependent on AWS. So this legislation to drive resilience for those systemically important players is really important, and the senior business leaders who are looking at those business services, Ben, that you highlighted that are so crucial to think about for resilience, who are thinking about their reputation and haven't yet really understood just how dependent they are on the organisations that are a particular focus of this legislation.
Yeah, interesting. Or when you say legislation, do you mean proposed legislation they're consulting on?
That the Europeans have a parallel consultation going on as well until May. Yes, the proposed legislation on cyber resilience, to me, reminds me that the year I was born, 1968, the government said it'd be really good if those big companies like Ford had to put a seatbelt in. I was 21 before everybody in the car was legally obliged to use the seatbelt. But we're gradually making progress, and going to the big players initially, the national infrastructure players, the internet service providers, and saying this is how you can help everybody to keep themselves safe, to develop cyber resilience for everybody, I think is a very good thing. And yes, to answer your question, Cyber Rescue Alliance, we're typically advising the chief operating officer or the chief risk officer on what the risks to their organization are and how to be resilient to them.
I see. Interesting. So just a quick discussion in the chat about whether we should bring Harry Potter into things. There seems to be some kind of revolution going on that people will leave in that case. So not mentioning any more Harry Potter stuff. Kevin, can I stay with you on that then? Because forgive me, I've missed the EU side of this as well. And just to break open this horrific Brexit-based can of worms, to what extent is our resilience legislation going to have to dovetail in the same way that things like GDPR are having to dovetail in order for us to be seamlessly transacting with the EU? Is there a risk there that our resilience...
I thought that's why Boris was in Brussels now, isn't it? Discussing cyber resilience. Oh, there's something else. There has always been close cooperation, listening to each other, at least on the legislation. It's a similar set of questions. It's very focused on the citizen within the EU, but very much looking at the systemically important players. I raise that just because I think taking a broader perspective, learning from other territories like Singapore, where famously you can go to jail for not protecting national critical infrastructure effectively from cyber attacks. To my knowledge, no one's been sent to jail, but it's a different perspective, an individual rather than a corporate, and jail rather than a fine, or how existing laws broadly. I'm sure some of the people on this teissTalk will have reflected at some point on the ransomware demand that's come in, and maybe even thought about that infamous 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act that the US Treasury were pointing out quite strongly a couple of years ago. You might be breaking this law that was invented in the First World War if you actually pay a ransom to a Russian-based ransomware gang. Be interesting to see if anybody pulls that off the shelf in the coming months. So yeah, I'm just arguing, take a broader historical perspective. It's not just the UK today that is thinking about issues that are relevant.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And Kevin, in terms of that EU question, I mean, as I say, I'm just intrigued as to whether we're just going to have to end up agreeing with the EU or doing what they do, or whether there's potential for us to be slightly different about it.
There are things that are happening in parallel within what the EU call the framework that we're definitely doing in the UK as well. So professional standards, and the technical equipment. So I would certainly hope that CISP and other recognised certifications for people who know what they're talking about on cyber are just the market should be allowed to say, yeah, well, clearly that's right. But there is a move to have some formal accreditation, like if you want to be a doctor going from one country to another, you ought to. And there's also, I think, good cooperation going on at a technical level, the obvious one being admin.admin, that if you're building an internet-connected device that's going to go into my child's bedroom, or to monitor the national infrastructure and how much chemical goes into the water treatment, clearly there is some agreement on what those standards should be that manufacturers
Yeah. And interesting, I know the DCMS put something out on that recently. Steve, can I come to you on this idea of a sort of cyber resilience legislation? It strikes me, we've got various, maybe not legislation, but various rules in. We've mentioned ISO, we've mentioned IASME. There's also the sort of PCI DSS. You know what I mean? The payment card. So, Steve, I just wonder: do you think there's actually the room for extra legislation? What would we put in it that isn't there already?
I think, well, the one we're alluding to here, I think, is DORA, right? The Digital Operational Resilience Act, which has been brought in by the European Commission, and that is designed to implement a level of accountability. And I think that's the reason, and that's the need for it, Jeff, is the fact that major corporations out there, in fact, just about any corporation out there now, is their reliance on the Internet of Things, on supply chains, IT services, cloud services, data storage services, is all now being outsourced. And with that has come a tendency to then believe that you're outsourcing your risk. And with that has then come, a lack of due diligence, a lack of oversight, really, of where your data is going and where your customers' data is going. And then we've seen countless supply chain attacks, certainly over the last 18, 24 months. And what the European Commission is looking at doing is bringing that accountability back, bringing that risk back into the main corporation, having the CISO, the Chief Risk Officer, and more charged with the duty to be able to perform that due diligence against critical third parties. So that's what DORA is designed to do. I think that's the need for it, because it needs regulation and it needs policing in a way. Now, who's going to actually do that, and what the sort of fine structure or penalty nature of that remains to be seen. And I know it's still in draft, but I think that's the real need for it, certainly, that we've seen at MasterCard and we see now throughout the financial institutions that we work with.
Yeah, it's interesting. But Ben, can I come to you on this? Because, I mean, we've talked a lot about on these programs about supply chain resilience and all that kind of thing. And the industry is absolutely discussing this, and is thanks to the SolarWinds and thanks to all these other supply chain attacks, they are all over. In my experience, in my view, they're all over this. do we really need legislation to be getting companies to be thinking and taking their supply chain seriously and working this out? It just strikes me that industry is already kind of moving on this, or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, Ben. What do you think?
I think industry are trying their best, but it is not an easy job. And I think the other thing is that supply chains, especially for big organizations, are massively complex. And it's understanding, and the key is not just understanding your third parties, but also your fourth parties. And the whole Okta breach this week, I think, is key for that. Because you may not be an Okta customer, but what happens if any of your supply chain are? And it's understanding those third and fourth factor issues that's the challenge. And I think whilst organisations are getting better, I think part of the reason for the legislation is that both the UK government and the EU think that we're not quite getting better quick enough, and that the impacts of the attacks, when you look at ransomware, they're becoming so critical to organisations and so potentially threatening of the whole viability of the organisations, that there's a feeling that needs to be done more. And I can appreciate that view, because part of it is understanding, and I think that's the key element with resilience. It's accepting that you will be breached and how you can address that, how you can respond back from that. It's not just the view that I think we perhaps had naively to start with, that, if we do all of the good things in security, we're going to be okay. Now we realize that no matter how good your security is, there will always be something that happens that causes that breach, and it's how you can respond to it that I think will be key.
Danny's just made a really great point. Sorry, Jeff. Danny's made a great point on the chat there about the legislation is needed to give organisations who take it seriously a chance. And I absolutely agree with him there, because it gives us as the cybersecurity professionals backing to go to our boards, to go to the CISOs and those amongst us and say, look, this is what we've been talking about. This is where we need to invest. And now there are regulations and legislation that are demanding it of us. It's no longer a nice to have, it's a need to have.
Yeah, I suppose it strengthens your arm, doesn't it? Chris has asked an interesting question in the Q&A, which I'm going to put to each of you. Ben, I'm going to start with you on this. Chris's question is, does the panel agree with expanding incident reporting obligations to also include incidents that do not affect business/operational continuity? So I guess near miss reports maybe might be what we call them. But putting words in Chris's mouth there. Ben, what do you think of that?
So I think when I read Chris's question, when he talks about business operational continuity, I think there can be incidents that your business will still continue working just fine, and you don't have to invoke disaster recovery, you don't have to do these, but it still could impact your customers' confidence in you. So that there are elements of an incident that absolutely could have an impact, could worry your customers, could have. Even if it doesn't impact you directly, it may impact your customers if you're part of that supply chain as well. So I think incident reporting does need to be robust. It needs to be timely, but it also needs to be at a level where incident reporting doesn't impact an organization's ability to actually deal with the incident. I think sometimes when you've had incident reporting, the timeframes that are there, you then spend more time answering questions to your regulator or to a relevant party than you do actually trying to address the issue and trying to bring it under control.
Yeah, interesting. What do you make of that, Kevin, the idea of reporting something, as I say, I'm calling it near miss.
And I think the allusion you're obviously making to the airline industry, where depending how you measure, it's 100 times safer per mile travelled to go by plane than by car. The analysis of those near misses is clearly been a great part of improving the safety of flying. And if we can find a mechanism to share those learnings, absolutely, completely behind it. The burden of regulation, the supervisory challenge. During the 2007-2008 financial crisis, we worked with a few regulators, financial regulators in different countries, and one of the anecdotes I've heard a few times is we realised that as the supervisor going in and asking, please tell us, exactly what your market credit liquidity details are, when literally banks were falling down day by day, wasn't the supervisory support that was being needed. The regulator needs to understand the business impact of what they're asking for. My personal view is the forums in which indicators of compromise, actionable intelligence are shared between FS-ISAC and other groups where, trusted communities, if they can be encouraged between the systemically important players at least, to make sure legally it's absolutely fine for you to share that information even though you normally compete. We want there to be a forum that what the bad guys are doing. That's what we've got to get to, actionable intelligence.
Interesting. Steve, what do you make of this? I mean, is this something that would add a considerable overhead to your job if you suddenly had to start doing this? No,
we already do it. So I think it's part of one of the sort of core functions of resilience is to evolve, right? Just because it's been a near miss doesn't mean that you can't learn from it. So be able to look, do a debrief with your teams, do a debrief with your close partners, your sort of trusted circle. And where you can, as Kevin suggests there, share the actionable intelligence within your peer group. Because you've got away with it this time, you might have successfully implemented a number of measures. Try and share those with your peer group, because hopefully they'll be the ones who are sharing things back with you again the other time. Because it's exactly what cyber criminals are doing. It's what organized crime groups and nation states are doing. They're continually debriefing their operations, where they work, where they don't. So we have to do the same thing. We have to share the ideas, and we certainly have to share actionable intelligence where we can.
Yeah. It's interesting though, Steve, that takes me back to this idea of, legislation and the usefulness of legislation. What you've just described sounds great. And I know there's information sharing partnerships all over the place where people are trying to do this sort of stuff. But that's A, that's come about without legislation. And B, I sort of struggle to kind of see how you would legislate that into being, Steve. Am I being too pessimistic here? Or?
Legislating it, yeah. I mean, certainly from a private sector perspective, it comes down to what our lawyers determine is best for our companies. But I think within the sort of trusted circles that many of us are members of, myself and Ben are members at MasterCard and Pay.UK are members of I4, we have those sort of trusted groups where we are able to share actionable intelligence and things that, good tips, bad tips, best practice, where you can share and you can help your peer group, certainly us, everybody on this call within cybersecurity, to help each other out. We don't want to be using it for competitive advantage within our own peer group here. We've long been advocates of that at MasterCard. Certainly use it to demonstrate to your customers that you are doing all you can to protect their data, but be able to share those best practices with your peers.
Yeah, interesting. Got a question coming in from Edward, which is an interesting one. And Ben, I'm going to ask this to you first and then the other panelists. In the US, says Edward, our critical infrastructure, for the most part, is run as a business and not under direct control of the government, brackets, yet. Interesting to see where Edward thinks that might be going. In the UK, what has been the most effective influence avenue to push infrastructure operators for cyber resilience aside from regulatory mandates? So the reason I like Edward's question is he's saying what worked apart from regulatory mandates. Ben, do you have an idea?
So first and foremost, I mean, we are a private company, but we do have that regulatory mandate. But part of it, and this is a process that we've always taken, is that for our retail schemes, the communication between ourselves, between VocalLink as the infrastructure provider, and between all of those banks, building societies, fintechs that are members and use our systems, it's having that communication and having that sharing is absolutely vital of the information, the indicators of compromise that Steve and Kevin were talking about, because we realize that any one of those components within our ecosystem could cause the system to go down. So it's not just a regulatory requirement, something that impacted 2, 3, 4 of our banks, that may affect every other bank's ability to send and receive payments. Right. So we need to work together as a group to make sure that we're addressing these things. Now, obviously, that's also the mandate of the Bank of England, who are one of our regulators, looking at the financial stability aspects. But it's not just that, the government groups and sharing ones aren't just, you have CISP from the National Cybersecurity Centre, but as I think Kevin mentioned, you have FS-ISAC, and there are other ones. Steve mentioned I4, which is another one, which is about sharing across sectors as well. And I think that's where it's so important. It's not just about looking at what your sector that you operate in. It's looking at what the issues that are happening in other sectors. And go back to Kevin's point about the aviation industry. You were talking about near misses. that's been a key tenet of the oil and gas industry as well, because I think Steve mentioned it a good way, getting away with it. Sometimes a near miss can happen because you've got really good controls. Other times a near miss can happen just because you're lucky and the right person happens to be at the right place at the right time. You should try and learn from that and make sure that other people are aware that might be an avenue that attackers are using. Or actually, if you're just in a trusted environment going, do you know what, we were lucky. And as a result, we've put in these additional controls to try and make sure that we don't have to be lucky. Because we have to be lucky every time. The bad guys only have to be lucky once to compromise someone.
Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting. So for Ben, it's the ability to sort of share experiences. Steve, can I come to you on this? But before we do, you mentioned I4, and Ben picked that up, and it occurred to me to pick that up. What is I4? What do we need to know about this?
Yeah, so I4 is a membership that's run by KPMG. It's cross-sector, and it's focused on cybersecurity, primarily chief information security officers, heads of cybersecurity, to come together in a trusted environment and share best practice. So we look at the hot topics of the day, we look at where people's pain points are, and we share, within a trusted circle where we think we can improve as a group and individually as well. So it's a welcome forum, and one that Mastercard have been a member of for the last 18 months, but it's been running for many years.
Yeah.
I happily provide the details after.
Well, yeah, our teissTalk, quick on the mark, as always, has put a link into I4 online, which is either the link for the I4 group or is some horrific porn site, which none of us want to. Click on it.
My work here is done.
Kevin, can I come to you on this issue as well of things to address Benjamin's questions, things that have happened in the UK that's helped push infrastructure people towards cyber resilience but aren't regulatory type interventions? What do you think, Kevin?
WannaCry. In the same way, I mean, to the point about was it Ben? You highlighted quite rightly that in oil and gas, it was the Piper Alpha 1998. Before that, I used to work in the oil and gas health and safety, believe it or not, and I'm still young enough that I was being told, there were no rules before that happened. Of course, that wasn't quite true, but they were really stringent in the few years I spent doing that. A disaster is what changed the culture as well as the legislation. And of course, WannaCry, to my knowledge, nobody actually died. Although we could all imagine that serious human harm might have done. And it's that kind of, at least, anecdote. Didn't happen to me. We all remember it. But the difficulty is then turning that into action. If it's not legislation, the thing we find that's useful is simulations with the executives. That really helps them understand their level of resilience.
Yeah, interesting. Really interesting stuff. And I never knew I was so sort of anti-regulation, but I'm still of the view that maybe regulation on this is a bit too heavy. But nonetheless, the government disagrees with me, as often they do. So the links to the consultation are in there if you want to take a look at that. The links to our speakers' LinkedIn profiles are also in the chat. Do please connect with them, continue the conversation there on LinkedIn. It's been absolutely fascinating on this. Really, really enjoyed it. Just keeps coming up, the cyber resilience point. So I want to thank our panelists, who are Ben Lindgreen, Head of Cyber Resilience at Pay.uk, Steve Brown, Cybersecurity Director at Mastercard, and Kevin Duffy, Managing Director at the Cyber Rescue Alliance. Thanks to all three of you. Nobody guessed successfully what was in the mug. It's Lemsip. Who said Lemsip? Who was that?
Kevin.
Kevin, well done. You win yourself a mug.
It's your voice. Okay.
Restricted from panelists for participants, but we will bend the rules on this occasion to send you a teissTalk mug. Yes, I'm suffering a little bit. Apologies. It's not COVID, but I have had a bad cold, so I've struggled willfully through.
Make sure the voice is better before the book is launched.
That's true. Thank you for that. Yeah, I'm actually doing you have to record. I'm recording the audio book, which for those of you who've ever done it is possibly the most boring job in the world. You sit in a little booth with a microphone and you just read your own book out for hours, and it's so boring. So I hope the voice is going to recover for that next week or whenever it is. Listen, we're here every Tuesday and Thursday at 4. Tuesday next week at 4. I don't normally judge who has the best teissTalk topics because me and Jenny, we share them out. It's fine, but bloody hell, she's got a good one next week. Negotiating a ransomware payment is Jenny's topic next week at 4. God, tune in for that. It's a fantastic one. She's got Neil Hare Brown, who's CEO of Storm Guidance, and Johan van Duin, who's Chief Information Security Officer at Do & Co, or Do & Co, depending on how you pronounce that one. Just a great topic. So it's a really, really fantastic one. The link is there in the chat, so you can put that in your diaries for next week. Have a fantastic rest of the day and a great weekend. Steve, Kevin, Ben, thank you so much for your time, and to our audience as well. See you again for another teissTalk soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.